Could North Carolina make it to the ACC Championship in 2024? I think they've got a much better chance than you might think. You look at their schedule and the way it sets up really, really well for them, and then you look at just the talent on this roster. I'm telling you, North Carolina is actually a contender in the ACC if things go just right for them. Before we get into the game-by-game predictions, though, let's just kind of run through the team, my thoughts on this team. I look at Max Johnson coming in at quarterback. I think he's a solid quarterback. No guarantee that he's going to win that job. They've got some young players on the roster as well that I'm sure will push. But I think he's a capable quarterback. You look at some of the weapons around him, pretty good. Running back with Amarian Hampton. This is one of the best running backs in all of college football this season. A decent offensive line, a very strong defensive line. I like that defensive line. I think that's going to be the strength of the defense. Behind that, average, maybe we'll see. And that's really an area where they have struggled. And, it's crazy to me because when I look at the roster each year, North Carolina has had talent on defense. It just has not come together. If it does all come together this year, if they click on defense, if Max Johnson can play really well for them at quarterback, North Carolina, I'm telling you, is a contender in the ACC. And a big part of that is because of this schedule. As you see, Vegas, they've got the over-under win total at 7.5. So they're expecting them 7-5 or 8-4. But again, back to the schedule. So forget the non-conference. They do play Minnesota in the non-conference. But just looking at their conference schedule, Duke, Pitt, Georgia Tech, Virginia, Florida State, Wake Forest, Boston College, NC State. How many of those games do you think they're going to be an underdog in? Probably just two. Probably Florida State and NC State. So you win just one of those games and take care of business in the other games. They're sitting there with one loss in the ACC. Even if they lose both of those games, two losses potentially could get them into the ACC championship. So it's a really, really favorable schedule for North Carolina. They will open up with Minnesota on August 29th on the road. That's going to be a really fun game and a really underrated game. I don't think anyone's really talking about that game. You look at Minnesota's run game against North Carolina's run game. That's going to be the story here. Minnesota did bring in a transfer quarterback who played really well at the FCS level, and I think will do really well for them with Daniel Jackson and some of those receivers. I think Minnesota is actually going to be a better team than people expect. I think this is a game where we see a decent amount of points. I know Minnesota, they like to slow the games down, and so maybe they don't score a ton of points in this game, but I think the offenses will be better than the defenses. But I think that home field advantage for Minnesota, and it's just a huge game for them, and they really need to win this game. I think they won a little bit more, and again, with that home field advantage, that's going to be enough, and Minnesota takes this one. So I've got North Carolina losing that game. Then they'll play Charlotte, NC Central, and James Madison. Of course, James Madison's coach is gone, so I don't expect them to be quite as good. That'll be potentially a pretty tough game for North Carolina, but I don't really see them losing that game, and definitely don't see them losing to Charlotte or North Carolina Central. So 3 wins in a row there. That puts them at 3-1, and they play all their non-conference games at the beginning of the season and then get into ACC conference play here on September 28th with a road game at Duke. All right, so Duke with Manny Diaz taking over. You'd expect the defense to be pretty solid. Offensively, they've still got some pretty good players, but depth-wise, just top to bottom, I think North Carolina is just ahead of where Duke is right now. And I don't know that Manny Diaz is going to come in there and be a great coach for Duke. So I think North Carolina, even on the road, is just a better team overall. This is probably a close game, not one that North Carolina is going to run away with, but I do think they've got enough with their offense and their defensive line to cause some disruption there, and I've got the Tar Heels winning that game. Pittsburgh is next on October the 5th at home. Not high on Pitt at all. I don't think this is going to be a very good team. Lost some of their better defensive players in the transfer portal. They weren't very good last year, and I don't think they're going to be very good. So North Carolina should roll there. Georgia Tech is next on October 12th at home. Interesting game here. I think these teams are pretty even. I don't really see any major advantages for one team over the other. I think we see some points in this one. I think it will be a more of a high-scoring game. Both quarterbacks, I think, will have pretty big days, and the run game, I think, will be pretty good for both teams. So I do expect a close one, some points to be scored. Home field advantage for North Carolina could be big here. I could see them losing this one. This is like a 50-50 game for me, but I'm going to go with North Carolina. I think they get this win. That puts them at 6-1. Not really any great wins, so I don't know if they'd be ranked at this point or not, but maybe they would at least be considered. They get a bye week before going on the road to face Virginia. Virginia team that seems to be headed in the right direction, but I don't think they're quite there yet. Again, kind of like with Duke, North Carolina's just going to have a lot more talent overall, a lot more depth. I think they'll wear them down in the second half. Another close game. I think Duke, Georgia Tech, Virginia, these are going to be close games, and if you follow North Carolina, they've struggled against some of these types of teams. They really haven't blown them out. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they lost one of those games, but I'm going to say they beat Virginia, get to 7-1, then they'll play on the road at Florida State. This will be probably the best defense they'll face all season. I pretty confidently can say that. Florida State's defense should be up to the task here. They're playing on the road at FSU. Just a recipe for a loss here, in my opinion. I think Florida State takes care of this one and drops North Carolina to 7-2. They get a bye week, and then they play Wake Forest. And look, North Carolina does this every year. They have a game or sometimes a couple of games where they just don't show up and they lose to inferior competition. And I think that's what we're going to see here. It's kind of one of those gut things. I think the passing game for Wake Forest is going to cause some problems for this North Carolina defense. It turns into a shootout. We go back and forth. And Dave Clawson, he's done it before. I think Wake Forest pulls off the upset over North Carolina. That's a pretty big one there. Drops them to 7-3. And maybe that's not the game they lose. But again, I'm going back to Duke, Georgia Tech, Virginia on the road, Wake Forest, and possibly even Boston College. I don't see North Carolina winning all of those games. I think they slip up somewhere. I'm going to say Wake Forest is that game just because of the matchup and the passing attack that's tough to stop there, and a secondary that's not going to be the strength of this North Carolina defense. So a shootout goes the way of Wake Forest. Then they'll play Boston College the next week on the 23rd. Not going to have the same type of passing attack as Wake Forest. A better matchup for North Carolina. It is on the road. Again, a game that they could lose, but I think they win a close one. So I think their overall talent, their roster, their depth, it's enough to win these types of games, but I don't think they win them all. I'm looking again at Duke, Georgia Tech, Virginia, Wake Forest, Boston College, and maybe I'm being a little favorable here for North Carolina. Maybe they lose a couple of those games, but I'm going to say they only lose one. They have NC State here to close things out at home, November 30th. This is going to be a good one. NC State is going to be a good team this year. With Grayson McCall at quarterback and some of the weapons they have on offense, it's going to be a tough offense to stop. And just kind of like the Wake Forest game, I think the secondary for North Carolina is not able to make enough stops. They'll score some points, but it's not going to be enough. I'm going NC State here, and North Carolina finishes at 8-4. So a solid season. Only 3 losses in the ACC. But it's hard for me to see this team doing much better than this because of the inconsistency we have seen out of North Carolina the last several years. Do they have the roster, the talent to go 10-2? Absolutely. But until I actually see them have a season like that, I just think that they slip up and again lose a game like the Wake Forest game. Minnesota they lose. I'm going to go 8-4. Give me your predictions though on North Carolina. Let me know what you think about them down in the comments below.